Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in recent weeks I've put together a number of videos. I think I've done 4 so far, where I've taken a look at videos in which different organizations or different individuals have published some kind of explanation of classical education, and I've shown again and again that these different groups, these different people, they all share in a number of errors, a number of ideas and teachings that they claim to be classical, but which really have no place in history. I looked at one video. I don't even remember the name of the school it was from, but it was talking about the development of classical education, and I talked about the red flags that were all introduced in that video, and then we looked at a couple of other videos, one by Martin Cawthron of Memoria Press. He actually responded to that video in a pretty bizarre response that I then responded to. And then Dr. Christopher Perrin, who represents Classical Academic Press. And I showed how the same errors from the first video, the same red flags, can be traced through these other videos because they all have just copied and pasted these same ideas. And I've emphasized this again and again. They've all copied and pasted these same ideas. They all say the same things. They all talk about the trivium as being these 3 stages of learning, or they talk about classical education that really has nothing to do with anything that was ever done in the history of the Christian church. They make all these historical assertions about what education used to be, which are nowhere to be found anywhere in world history, certainly not in Christian history. I talked about how they use these marketing catchphrases like truth, goodness, and beauty. I talked about how they make ridiculous promises to parents that if you use this curriculum, your children will basically be filled with the fruits of the Holy Spirit, simply if you get the book list right or the secret method right. And we went through these things for a few videos, and I think we've settled those issues, that they're not historical. They pull phrases and terms out of context, and really they just become a method of selling stuff, especially in Catholic circles, because these things have nothing to do with any Catholic history or philosophy of education. And I want to make that really clear. This fake classical education movement, which is popular in Catholic circles, has nothing to do with historical Catholic education. And I'm going to say it one more time because I want this to be crystal clear. This fake classical education movement, where people talk about Dorothy Sayers and they talk about the 3 stages of learning, grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric, and they talk about all of this great books culture and all this stuff, this really has nothing to do with Catholic education. And it's inexcusable that Catholics have embraced this. Inexcusable that Catholics have embraced this because it has no part in Catholic tradition. Now, some might doubt that. Some might say, "Oh, you're just being uncharitable, negative, critical. You're just trying to promote your own ideas," on and on and on. I hear this stuff 24 hours a day. I assert that this fake classical education movement is not something innocent for Catholics to play around with. I think it's an example where modern Catholics, trying to pretend that they're smart without doing research, without being careful, without actually looking back to church history, without actually studying Catholic philosophical sources, Catholic educational sources, without doing the research, Catholics have led hundreds, if not thousands, of families into a false approach to education, a false idea of education. And I blame people like Laura Berquist most of all for doing this, just recklessly running into this classical education movement, copying and pasting all the ideas, rushing to print to try to be the first one to make the money, to sell the book, and so on, without having done the research, without being careful, without actually desiring the truth, and that these people are responsible for confusing and discouraging thousands and thousands of Catholic families and misleading them, many of them, to think that they understand Catholic education and are giving their children an education that was known to the saints and wise men of the past. I've made that assertion. I wrote an article, How Laura Berquist Has Misled Thousands of Families. I published that on the Academy website, and that article has received a lot of attention. I map out the history to show where those ideas, which became the mother of Divine Grace Catholic homeschool curriculum, where they came from. And I explained that they have no origin in any Catholic educational history. They have no origin in any Catholic educational philosophy. And I would go even further, and I would say that the ideas that Laura Berquist made popular among ignorant Catholic people, the ideas that Laura Berquist and Mother of Divine Grace School ran into publishing with, and now have thousands of kids studying and learning instead of real Catholic education, have misled thousands of families. Now, I know that people will say, oh, you know what, you're just a jerk. You're just some nasty guy who thinks that he knows the right way and everybody else is wrong. I've had people tell me that they used the Mother of Divine Grace program and their kids turned out to be happy, as if that's attributed to a curriculum program. That's not the issue. As I've said again and again in these videos, I'm not interested in judging any individuals. The grace of God can overcome anything. I'm a public school graduate. My wife is a public school graduate. We went to public universities. That has nothing to do with the grace of God working in the hearts of individual people, because the sacramental life is in the church, not in a school somewhere. It's not in a curriculum. Salvation comes in and through the church. It's not our education that makes us Christians. It's not our education that makes somebody a Catholic. It's God's grace working through the gospel, giving us faith, leading us step by step through our life experiences, good and bad, into the true Catholic faith. And we can't attribute that to any educational program. We also can't attribute the loss of faith to any educational program, because kids overcome all kinds of problems. People overcome all kinds of problems, horrible experiences, abuses, false teaching, drugs, every imaginable evil. Christian people with the grace of God will overcome. And that's why we have to separate all of these distracting side issues We have to separate all of these distractions. And like I've said, I'm not judging people. I'm not judging individuals. I'm not saying a school that practices this is evil. I haven't said anything like that. I've made it clear again and again and again that that's not my message. What I've said is, when we talk about education and we advertise that an education has a place in Catholic history and proceeds from principles of education that were held by wise men and saints in the past, we have to be true. We have to tell the truth and be accurate. Because I believe there is a place where education does have an influence. God's grace can overcome all of our failures, all of our mistakes, all of our sins. But for Christian culture, Catholic culture, to be renewed and thrive, there has to be a collaboration of human work with God's grace, and the human work has to be right. The human work has to be right for there to be a flourishing of Catholic culture. And this fake classical education movement doesn't have the education right. God's grace will overcome that. There will be priests, there will be monks and nuns in very small numbers. But the flourishing that's possible when the grace of God is joined to prudent Catholic work, that's never going to come until these things are fixed. It's never going to come through a fake classical education movement that doesn't even tell the truth. And so if we want to see a renewal of the culture that proceeds from this grace-filled Catholic life, we're going to have to restore real classical Catholic education. And as long as this fake stuff continues to be promoted and bought and used by Catholic families, the hope of this renewal of Catholic culture is just going to be pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And that's my concern. The ideas of this fake classical education movement, which we find in a place like Mother of Divine Grace School, has its roots not in Catholic history or Catholic philosophy, but it has its roots in Protestantism. It comes from Protestantism. The ideas were borrowed from Protestants, brought into Catholic circles, dressed up with Catholic images, and put on sale. That's what happened. Let me say that again. This fake classical education movement in Catholic circles was taken from Protestants, dressed up in Catholic appearances, and sold to Catholic people. And the best example of this is Mother of Divine Grace School. Even the name, it was dressed up in or with the name of Our Lady, which I think is pretty grievous, especially when we consider that the tradition in church, as St. Albert the Great taught, was that Mary was always understood to be one who, by the grace of God, possessed a knowledge of the liberal arts, as crazy as that might sound, of the 7 classical liberal arts. St. Albert the Great, commenting on Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1, where we read, "Wisdom has built herself a house, and hath hewn its 7 pillars." That's Proverbs 9, verse 1. St. Albert the Great, a doctor of the church, commenting on that passage, explained it in a Catholic sense and said, "Wisdom hath built her house, and the house that wisdom built is the Blessed Virgin Mary." The Blessed Virgin Mary is the house that wisdom has built. And the pillars of that house are the 7 classical liberal arts. That was taught by St. Albert the Great in the 1100s concerning true wisdom, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the educational system that was promoted among the saints throughout the history of the Catholic Church. That has been abandoned, that system, and unfortunately, the Virgin Mary has been taken away from that system and used as a marketing gimmick to sell a Protestant curriculum, a curriculum based on Protestant ideas that have no place in Catholic history and are contrary to the principles of Catholic education, and have used the name and image of the Virgin Mary and the saints to sell Protestant ideas to Catholic families. And I have no way of proving this. But I believe that at some point, Catholics knowingly took these ideas from Protestant sources. I mean, I can prove at least one Protestant source was drawn from, and that's Dorothy Sayers, because she's quoted, and she is a Protestant woman, and she's quoted all over Catholic websites as if she's some kind of medieval guru or saint. She's a Protestant writer, Dorothy Sayers. And yet she is the guru quoted all over these Catholic educational websites. And I would argue that she's not the only Protestant source that was used, that there were others. What I would like to do in this video is look at something a little bit different. And I think that this will be very helpful for Catholic families. As I've always explained, I was a Protestant. I converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so sensitive to this Protestant influence. I taught in Protestant classical schools. I taught in schools where this fake classical education came from. I taught in schools that were the leading sources of this fake classical education movement. Now, I was at the schools, and when I taught, I was simply working to teach Latin and Greek and literature and things like that. I was a classicist. And I used to sit there and just, have my brain spinning inside my head as I listened to these Protestant people talk about classical education and use these ideas of the trivium to talk about the stages of learning. Because as a classicist, I knew that this was all a bunch of baloney, but I was just learning at the time, and it was one of the few places where I could find work as a classics teacher, and I wanted to work in a school teaching classics because I was in graduate school at the time, continuing to study, and I was also already in the midst of my research work seeking to understand the true classical education. And so it was just a time in my life where I was in a transition, starting to piece things together, collecting all the resources, while also still in school, having to provide for my family and so on. It was a complicated time in my life, but I was there in these schools, and I'll give you some proof. One of the leading sources of this fake classical education movement is Veritas Press. Veritas Press is a Protestant organization. I would consider the people there to be friends of mine. I worked with those people, and like I said, I'm not judging these people as individuals because they're good people. They're good people. But Veritas Press was one of the maybe 2 or 3 leading publishers of the Protestant classical education movement's resources. Okay, so get this all straight. The Protestant classical education movement is where this fake Catholic classical education movement came from. This Protestant classical education movement started back in the 80s and 90s. One of the principal sources that published and developed these resources was Veritas Press in Pennsylvania. I worked at Veritas Press for 1 year. It was the last year of my Protestant life, right as I was converting to Catholicism. I spent a year at Veritas Academy in Pennsylvania and wrote for Veritas Press. So I was a part of this Protestant classical education movement as I was converting to Catholicism. If you want proof of this, you can get a Veritas Press catalog, look up their Omnibus 1, their first omnibus textbook, and if you look at the authors who contributed to that first textbook that they published on classical literature, you'll see my name is in that book. I wrote the chapter on Plutarch's Lives. So if you want proof that I was right in the midst of this Protestant classical education movement, you can look right there in the Veritas Press Omnibus textbook and see that I was one of the authors contributing to that series. It was right after I finished that assignment to write that part of the textbook that I decided to convert to Catholicism. And when I converted to Catholicism, I was told that I obviously couldn't stay there, and that's why I moved to North Carolina. That's how I got here. It was right at that time. Now, in that Protestant classical education movement, there was an organization called the Association of Classical Christian Schools. This was the source of the Protestant classical education movement. And the founder of that organization, and really the founder of that Protestant classical education movement was a man named Douglas Wilson. He's a Reformed Protestant pastor who lives out in Idaho. And he is the founder. He was the source of that Protestant classical education movement, started back in the 90s. He was the source of that movement, and I'll say the name again, Douglas Wilson. Douglas Wilson. He wrote a book titled Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Dorothy Sayers gave a speech back in the early 1900s, and the speech she gave was called The Lost Tools of Learning. And in this, she, a Protestant who had, she was not an educator or a teacher or anything like that. She was a novelist. And she gave a lecture during a vacation period at Oxford University. And she talked about education, and she called her lecture The Lost Tools of Learning. She was complaining about modern education and giving her opinions about what she thought should be done. She gave this lecture. It was titled The Lost Tools of Learning, and I don't know that anyone ever talked about that lecture after it was given. Douglas Wilson obviously at some point got a hold of that lecture, latched on to this idea of the lost tools of learning, and wrote a book titled Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. And this was back in the early to mid-90s. I read that book when I was in college, actually. It was a book that was given to me, and I read through it and learned about this Protestant classical education movement. And remember, I'm a secular classicist. So I came into classical studies, studying the classics, studying Virgil and Cicero and Aristotle and Plato as a classicist, not even as a a Christian coming in to classics. I was a classicist coming into Christianity and eventually into Catholicism. But I read some of these books because I was a Protestant and they were moving around at the time. And I read this book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning by Douglas Wilson. And this book became the source of this Protestant classical education movement. It led to the formation of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. They had conferences and all kinds of resources that they published and promoted this Protestant classical education movement, which as a Catholic I call the fake classical education movement, because it's just a Protestant idea. It's not the historic Catholic educational system of the saints and wise men of history. It's a Protestant idea. It's the Protestant classical education movement, and again, the source was this book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. In this video that I'd like to comment on here, we're actually going to see an interview with this man, Douglas Wilson. The man in this interview is the man who wrote that book, is the man who founded this Protestant classical education movement, which was simply borrowed and brought into Catholic circles by people like Laura Berquist and Mother of Divine Grace School. And you'll see that explicitly as soon as you hear him speak. This is where it came from. It's a Protestant idea about education with Protestant sources. And he's going to explain the sources in the couple of clips that I'm going to look at here in this video. These Protestant ideas, which again make perfect sense in Protestant circles, and I don't really fault these Protestants because these Protestants are fighters. They're trying to solve problems within a Protestant perspective, and I think that they're praiseworthy. What's disgraceful to me is Catholics simply borrowing their ideas, rebranding them, and presenting them as Catholic ideas, dressed up in images and names that are Catholic, and it's just complete misleading book sales. I mean, it's, I can't express how impossible it is for me to believe that Catholics would do this. And also, I can't believe that so many Catholics fell for it and continue to fall for it and even fight for it, as if anyone who questions it is crazy. And I know I'll be hit with the uncharitable card, which is simply an accusation that's made against anyone who says something that Catholic people don't like and presents it in a way where they bring evidence with it to make others feel the heat of their argument. They think that heat is a lack of charity rather than an actual persuasiveness, which is what it is. They would rather defend someone who has misled people and taught falsely because she's smiley than listen to a person who's showing them that what they're saying and doing is false. It's just impossible for me to grasp. There are Catholics who will criticize popes and bishops about the liturgy and yet not criticize someone who's directing the education of thousands of Catholic families and just promoting stuff in the name of Our Lady that isn't even Catholic. So what I'd like to do, rather than make this William Michael against some other Catholic people, I'd like to offer some more proof that this is true. And what I'd like to do is share a couple of spots from an interview that was conducted with this Protestant pastor, Douglas Wilson, who was the founder of this Protestant classical education movement back in the early 1990s, and have you hear from his own lips how this thing got started, where it came from. And when he gets into it, not in the first part, but in the second part that I'm going to share, you're going to see exactly where the fake classical education movement came from. And you're going to see how inexcusable Catholics are who have promoted it and continue to promote it, and who have fallen for it and continue to fall for it. Because he's going to explain the source of it explicitly. So we're going to watch this. The first part I want to show you, a couple minutes, is Douglas Wilson explaining where the classical education movement came from, which I'm calling the fake classical education movement. But again, this is its Protestant source. I'm talking in a Catholic context. This is where it started in Protestant circles. He's going to explain how it started, and I'd like you to listen to that. I'm going to walk you through that. And then later he's going to explain the philosophy of education that's promoted in this so-called classical education and where it came from. So we're going to learn about the origin of that approach to education, which, again, is all over Catholic websites and school brochures all over the country, if not around the world. We're going to see where it actually came from, and I'll comment on it, obviously, as we go through it. So let's begin. Let me flip over to this other screen here. We're going to watch this interview, a couple parts, just a couple minutes of this interview with Douglas Wilson, Classical Education with Douglas Wilson. All right? Douglas Wilson is the older man in the beard. Like I said, he is the author of the book Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. He is the founder of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. He's a Protestant pastor out in Moscow, Idaho, where he had started a school called the Logos School, which became sort of the model of this Protestant classical education movement. So this is Douglas Wilson. I'm not concerned with the interviewer. You know, he's insignificant, but I want you to listen to Douglas Wilson explain where all of this fake classical education stuff came from, because he was the source of it in Protestant circles. And again, when I say fake classical education, I'm really not criticizing the Protestants, because for them to do this is understandable. But my criticism is aimed at Catholics who allowed this into Catholic circles and just swallowed it up and fell for it. So let's listen here to Douglas Wilson explain the origin of this classical education movement back in the 80s and 90s.
So you've been in the world of classical education for
This is Douglas
now.
Wilson here.
And as you've been in this world of classical ed, you've written about it, you've contributed to different books. What would you say has been the impact of your own work on the movement as a whole?
I think I was probably the spark in a room that was full of fumes already. So basically, or the rock that somebody kicked at the top of the avalanche. So I've been involved in the movement, but it was basically, it was demonstrably an idea whose time had come. So there was a great hunger for something like this.
And was it your book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, which I'm holding right here? Was this the book that gave that initial nudge, or was it something else?
No, it was that book that was the spark.
That book was the spark.
So what happened was, back in the 80s,
Notice the
the
timeline.
Reconstructionist movement was a thing where, and they were doing a lot of good work seeking to make the Bible relevant to every aspect of life. But there were also some...
Let me interrupt here just to make sure that you're reminded that he's a Protestant pastor talking about Protestant issues back in the 1980s. He mentioned the Reconstructionist movement, which you might want to look into. So just realize that this is not a Catholic discussion. He's a Protestant pastor, an influential Protestant teacher and thinker and writer in what are called Reformed or historical Protestant circles. So there was a movement already developing in Protestant circles, and he's talking about how that eventually develops. Let me back up a little bit, but just remember he's living in and talking about a Protestant world that as a Catholic you may not be familiar with.
Attitude problems in the Reconstruction movement, and as a pastor I liked what I was learning from the books, but I couldn't really commend books across the board. I belonged to the Conservative Book Club, and one day I got I saw a book called The Turning Point by Marvin Lasky and Herbert Schlossberg, who wrote the magnificent book Idols for Destruction.
Okay.
And I saw that this book was the initial book in a series of the Turning Point Worldview series, and I saw that it was an attempt to do what the Reconstructionists were doing, but without the attitudes and without the some of the other problems. So I contacted Marvin Lasky, and to make a long story short, I wound up getting the contract to do the book on educations in this series. So it's now this series of books had they had a book on foreign policy and a book on going to the movies and a book on literature and a book, So when you read the book, the worldview book on going to the movies, you'd put the book down when you're done and you said, honey, let's go to the movies and think about it in a worldviewish way.
Yeah.
And that was the case for a bunch of these books. But when people finished my book, they put it down and said, we have to start a school.
So let me stop there. So you can see he's mentioned that his book was the spark that got this classical education movement rolling, because he took these ideas, these sort of vague ideas that lots of Protestant people had at that time. They felt that there was a need for something, and they were talking about these issues on a number of different topics. And he was the one who was given the task of writing the book in this series, the Turning Point series, on the topic of education. And he said the influence of that book, and this is true, I can testify to this, the influence of that book was that people read that book, and he's talking about Protestants, they read that book and they said, we have to start a school. That's where the classical education movement came from. That's where the Association of Classical Christian Schools came from. That's where the classical education movement started, and that's where the fake classical education movement that spread like cancer into Catholic circles came from. It came from this event, this book, as that classical education movement started in Protestant circles. Now, that's what I wanted to show you there. And now the next part, I have to just find this spot. I think it's around the 12-minute mark. Just bear with me as I find this next spot. So there we have an explanation of, let me just get there real quick.
76.
Right.
Yeah, this is the spot. Okay. So in that first clip, we saw Douglas Wilson there. Again, he's the guy in the beard, explaining this book that he wrote called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, how it was sort of a part of a movement among Protestants who wanted to pursue some alternative to modern education. And he wrote this book, and it inspired people to say, let's go start schools. And that's where that movement started. this classical education movement. So anytime you hear talk about the classical education movement, and you'll hear Catholics talking about it like it's something that Catholics might have started. This is where the classical education movement started. He is the guy, Douglas Wilson. His book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, was the starting part, the spark of the classical education movement. Now, in this second clip, the interviewer is going to ask him about classical education. What is classical education? What's the philosophy of classical education? And Doug Wilson's going to explain it. According to this Protestant classical education movement, he's going to explain where it came from and what the principles are. And what I want you to see is that what he's explaining is completely Protestant. In his mind, he understands that what he's explaining is a Protestant idea. That's why he's excited about it. That's why Protestants want to run and start schools when they learn these ideas, because this is a Protestant idea that they believe in and that they are zealous to go and put into action. He explains the sources, the ideas, and what you'll see is that these are the exact same ideas that Catholics have put all over their classical education websites, catalogs, schools, and so on. It's the same exact stuff. This is where it comes from. It's not coming from somebody sitting around studying the church fathers or studying Thomas Aquinas and saying, oh, you know what I think we Catholics should do? I think we should start this classical. That's not where it came from. It came from this Protestant movement. This Protestant movement is the source of the fake classical education movement that is being marketed and sold by Catholics to Catholics who don't understand where the ideas came from, that they're just gobbling up because some smiley people who are Catholics are telling them, oh yeah, this is how to raise saints. Oh yeah, this is what used to be done all back through church history, putting pictures of the saints on their books, putting Our Lady, her image and her name all over their catalogs and schools and books. Buy it up, buy it up. It's a Protestant educational philosophy being marketed as a Catholic educational program to Catholics who don't even ask for any proof. That's what is just incomprehensible to me. But in this second clip, he's going to explain the philosophy of education, what classical education is. And remember, he's talking as the founder of this movement who wrote this book. These aren't ideas that he learned along the way. These were the ideas that he wrote about in that original book, way back, 30 years ago. Okay? He's going to talk about these ideas and where they came from. And you'll see the source of this fake classical education movement. So remember, one of the red flags I told you to watch out for in the fake classical education videos was the use of the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the use of those names to simply rename elementary school, middle school, and high school. When in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world, those words were actually the names of arts that were to be studied from specific sources in classical literature. The art of grammar, the art of logic, the art of rhetoric. The arts of grammar, they were studied in a number of different sources. One of the authors was a writer named Priscian, that you'll see his name in medieval times. And then we have, there's also a Varro, V-A-R-R-O, who is a Roman grammarian. There were sources for learning the arts of grammar. And mastery of those books, which were the textbooks that explained all of the principles of the art of grammar, that's what it meant to study grammar. And then in Catholic times, Catholics published new forms of these grammars, like Alvarez's grammar, which was promoted by the Jesuits, and Lilly's grammar, which was used in England. But there were grammar textbooks, established classical grammar textbooks that were to be studied and mastered, which were studied and mastered for centuries and centuries. The art of grammar. The art of reasoning, studied in the reasoning works of Aristotle, which are called the Organon. And then the art of rhetoric, which was studied in Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric, and then in a number of rhetorical treatises, or I could say textbooks, that were written by Cicero in Roman times. Those were the books, and that knowledge was what it meant to study grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It meant that you had studied and mastered those sources. And the same was true of the other four arts: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. They were a set of books by certain master authors, master philosophers, and teachers. And the knowledge and mastery of those books is what it meant to have an education in the classical liberal arts. That's what it meant. But in this fake classical education movement, the names of grammar, logic, and rhetoric are taken from that system in history and are used to rename elementary school, middle school, and high school. And parents are told that what they're being sold, this elementary school program that's called the grammar stage, this middle school program that's called the logic stage, and this high school program that's called the rhetoric stage, were actually the studies or the method of studies that were used by the saints and wise men in the past, and it's a complete lie. It's a complete lie. And the parents walk around parroting this historical lie, never for a moment asking for any proof, just taking it up and running with it, pretending that it's true. This idea of grammar, logic, and rhetoric as three stages of learning, Doug Wilson's going to explain where that came from. And what I'd like you to do, if you use one of these Catholic classical education programs that teaches this, I'd like you to ask the people publishing and selling those programs, where did you get this idea from? Because this is where it came from. Ask them, why are you selling us Protestant ideas? Because this is where it came from. I'll let Doug Wilson explain, so listen carefully.
Right. Okay. And so what are we talking about here? What's the philosophy of classical Christian education? Is there a single worldview behind this movement? Is that necessary?
Yeah, I could put classical education, classical Christian education into a nutshell this way. It has two components. One is the methodology, and the second is the content. So the methodology of the curriculum and the content of the curriculum. The methodology follows basically the trivium, and this was Dorothy Sayers' insight in her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. Mm-hmm. So the trivium, which was a medieval approach to education, consisted of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. Those were the three elements. So trivium, the Latin word via, is the word for road. And so basically trivium means three-way intersection, three roads coming together, three paths. And so the trivium is grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And what Dorothy Sayers did was, her insight was that we can take there was an educational reformer at the time of the Reformation named John Comenius.
Okay, I'm going to stop here for a minute just to summarize what he said. He was asked, what is classical Christian education? And notice how, unlike some of the other videos we saw, Martin Cawthron and Dr. Christopher Perrin, they were very tentative and uncertain when they answered their questions about what is classical education. Remember, Dr. Perrin said, well, it's impossible. How can I possibly explain this? Well, the reason why is because his answer wasn't grounded in any historical information or actual knowledge. He was parroting these ideas and may not even know where they really originated. The same with Martin Cawthron. Martin Cawthron, if you listen to him talk, he talks as if he's always figuring out what he's going to say as it comes out of his mouth. Notice how different it is listening to Doug Wilson. When Doug Wilson is asked, what is classical Christian education? Is there a philosophy behind it? Notice how he's just boom, 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 very comfortable, very confident. The reason why is because he's the source of these ideas. These are his ideas. He knows exactly where they came from. He can talk about them very comfortably because they're his ideas. These other people, they're just parroting and selling these ideas, and they really don't even know where they come from. Or maybe they do, but they can't let the cat out of the bag because, of obvious implications. But I want you to see just how comfortable Douglas Wilson is talking about this because he's the source of these ideas. Okay? So the interviewer asks him, what are we talking about? What is classical Christian education? And Doug Wilson gets right to it. He says there's two things, right? There's a method and there's content. And he didn't get to the content yet, but he's talking about the method. And this is what all of these fake classical Catholic educational programs are always selling. They're selling this idea that the trivium is this method of learning, right? It's not what I explained, the 3 arts of the 7 classical liberal arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, that you can study in books. That's not what they say. They say it's this approach to learning, this method of learning, 3 stages of learning, grammar, logic, rhetoric. He's explaining where this comes from. He said, in the Middle Ages, there was this thing called the trivium. Well, actually, the trivium are just 3 of 7 arts. But he's right. In the Middle Ages, there was this thing. This was the real education in medieval times, in Catholic times. There was this thing. But then, he explains, Dorothy Sayers took it and did something else with it. That's what he's explaining. I'll let that go again. Just listen again.
Lost tools of learning. Mm-hmm. So the trivium, which was a medieval approach to education, consisted of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. Those were the 3 elements. So trivium, the Latin word via, is the word for road. And so basically trivium means 3-way intersection, 3 roads coming together, 3 paths. And so the trivium is grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric.
Listen here.
And what Dorothy Sayers did was, her insight was that we can take, there was an educational reformer at the time of the Reformation named...
Now, what he's going to do here, just to help you understand this, he's going to say, actually, Dorothy Sayers' ideas were based on someone else's ideas. And he's going to talk about John Comenius. And if you're in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you may recognize that name. John Comenius was a Protestant educational thinker. He was the author of the book that we use for Latin vocabulary. And I know that, that may be annoying to say, why do we have to use a Protestant book? It's just because it's a good vocabulary textbook. Okay, so you may have heard the name John Comenius because the Latin vocab course that we have is actually his Latin vocab book. I think it's helpful. I usually recommend that kids just study Latin reading anyway, so it's not essential. It's not one of our core courses anyway. But that man, John Comenius, that's who Doug Wilson's talking about here. And he's going to explain what John Comenius did as a Protestant in education in the, 1500s or so. Okay, so in order to understand Dorothy Sayers' idea, we have to back up a little bit, and first you have to understand John Comenius's idea. So I think John Comenius's Latin vocabulary book is useful, but I totally reject John Comenius's philosophy of education, and I can explain why, but I'm not going to in this video. But what I want you to see, Doug Wilson is saying, this idea of the trivium being 3 stages of learning, that came from Dorothy Sayers. Not history, not the Middle Ages. That came from Dorothy Sayers. She made that. And her idea came from John Comenius. So listen as Doug Wilson explains this history of where all this stuff comes from. I'll back up a little bit here.
3 elements. So trivium, the Latin word via, is the word for road. And so basically trivium means 3-way intersection, 3 roads coming together, 3 paths. And so the trivium is grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric.
Now listen carefully.
And what Dorothy Sayers did was, her insight was that we can take, there was an educational reformer at the time of the Reformation named John Amos Comenius, who, believe it or not, invented the idea or came up with the idea of prerequisites. So
now listen how he compares.
They would take promising, bright young children and throw them in the deep end of the pool, and they could swim. They would figure out how to swim.
So stop there. Notice what Doug Wilson explains. He says, back in the Middle Ages, so when Catholics were in charge of education, he's talking about real classical Catholic education. He says they would take gifted students and just throw them in, and they would swim. Notice what he just said. What he's talking about there is the real classical education. So when you come into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and you say, where do we begin? Where do we begin? And I say, just get the kids started. They'll be fine. The problem is not the kids. I always explain this to parents. 99% of the problems kids have in education are caused by the adults around them. It's not the kids. Put them in the classical Catholic curriculum and give them time. They will swim. Now, of course, no, they won't swim if they're completely, have no intellectual gifts, and it's not God's will for them to pursue any significant academic work. No, those kids won't succeed, but they shouldn't be in school in the first place. And the only reason they're even in school is because of our dopey compulsory education laws that we have, that were invented by American politicians. But they took kids who had the ability to learn and they put them in the classical educational system. That was the Catholic way of educating kids. And as he said, John Comenius was the father or the inventor of this modern idea of prerequisites. So when you show up and say, well, what courses are prerequisite? That's not how school used to work. And I can explain, lots of reasons why that way of thinking is not prudent, because it's not sustainable. And this is why we've got these ginormous educational systems where we're trying to create this assembly line of learning. And it just never happens because it becomes so inefficient, so time-consuming, so expensive, because we're trying to build this assembly line educational system, that this idea that sounds good is not practicable. And that's why the wise men of the past didn't try to do it. They knew that the mental capacity of children could overcome the difficulties that they would face, and they just needed time. That's how education was handled. That's why the Jesuits could offer free schools. That's why it could be simple and affordable and sustainable. A parish priest could start teaching kids with just a couple books sitting at a table. There was nothing needed because they just trusted the human ability and capacity to learn in the children to overcome the obstacles. They didn't try to create some assembly line system. But the Protestants came along because the Protestants were always trying to reach the common people, just like Martin Luther did when he published the 95 Theses, which were supposed to be kept in the church disputation hall. He published them for the street people. The Protestants, because they're schismatics, they were always concerned with getting to the common people. And so when it came to education, the Protestants wanted to create an education that reached the common people. And so they were concerned with building this system where you could take ungifted kids that had no business in school and you could put them through a school program. And this is where the American public school system comes from and all that stuff. But you can see Wilson reveals to us how education worked before and the changes that started to be made to that education when the Protestants got to work. Comenius started thinking of prerequisites, and listen to him explain this here. I'll back up just a little bit, and we'll pick up.
Whether or not invented the idea or came up with the idea of prerequisites. So
here's the old-fashioned way.
They would take promising, bright young children and throw them in the deep end of the pool, and they could swim. They would figure out how to swim.
That's what we want.
But Comenius figured out how to teach average kids by walking them slowly through various prerequisites.
That's where modern
Dorothy
education
Sayers
comes
took
from.
the medieval trivium, combined it with what Comenius taught about prerequisites, and said, hey, look, why don't we put the grammar stage at the elementary school age,
Sound familiar?
the dialectic stage at roughly the junior high years, and the rhetoric stage at the high school years. And she said, this is cutting with the grain. So the grammar stage is the accumulation of raw data.
This is where this
and kids love to memorize. They
came
love
from.
to chant and memorize. So her insight was when they love to memorize, have them memorize. And then when they get into the ornery junior high, why are you making me do this stage, that when they become argumentative, she said, teach them logic, teach them how to argue, cut with the grain. And then in the high school years, when they become concerned with how they're coming across, how they're presenting themselves, teach them rhetoric. So what she did was she said, put the trivium in this order: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. So that's the method. So all ACCS schools have that structural methodology. The kids do a lot of memorization of the grammar of different subjects.
I'm going to stop there. You've had it explained very clearly and explicitly by the Protestant pastor who wrote the book that started the classical education movement. He explained that this idea, this methodology of what he calls classical education, the Protestant classical education, is based on the teaching of Dorothy Sayers, who was a Protestant novelist, who came up with this idea of there being 3 stages of learning. And she took the names from the medieval trivium, from the old education. She took the names and she applied them to the 3 divisions of the modern schools and rebranded the modern education and made some superficial suggestions for what to do based on the modern idea of education, which came from the Protestant ideas of John Comenius, who wanted to create an educational system where all of the common people, all what Doug Wilson calls the average students, could all be made to go to school and be taught how to think. This is where the American public school system came from. That's why it's always odd when Protestants criticize the modern schools, because the modern schools came from Protestant ideas. The alternative to the modern schools is not the Dorothy Sayers method The alternative to the modern schools is the old method that he referred to, the actual medieval education. That's what you find in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. That's what we're restoring, that original, real classical education. This idea is the fake classical education movement. Dorothy Sayers, a Protestant, working from assumptions that were promoted by a Protestant educational reformer, John Comenius, to come up with a system of education that would be taken up by Doug Wilson in the 1990s, promoted through a book called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, which would become the source of the classical education movement, all from Protestant ideas, and then taken by Catholics and just pulled into Catholic circles, rebranded with Catholic images and names, all kinds of Catholic stuff to dress it all up and sell it to Catholic families. That's what's been done in Catholic education. That's the fake classical education movement that I talk about. The real classical education movement is the one that he mentioned, the one that was replaced by the Protestants like John Comenius, which was not changed but continued by Dorothy Sayers, taken up and promoted by Doug Wilson, spread through Protestant circles, taken up by Catholics, and spread through Catholic circles. That's not the education that we're interested. That's not Catholic education. That's Protestant educational philosophy dressed up with images of saints who were not educated according to that philosophy, who never educated others according to that philosophy. Using their name, image, and likeness, as it were, to sell a product that has nothing to do with the lives or studies or teachings of those saints that are used to market the program. This is where they actually come from. What we want is that real education which existed before the Protestant Reformation. And if you go look on the YouTube channel, on my channel, I did a video that explains how the Protestant schism or the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution of that period, which John Comenius was leading, I explained how it destroyed Catholic education. I explain it in detail. In the book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, I've explained all of this in detail. I've been explaining this since 2009, 14 years or so now, 2008 actually. I've been explaining this to Catholic families and they just don't care. I can say the educational philosophy that you're dressing up with Catholic images and telling yourself is a Catholic education is from Protestant sources, and they don't care. And if I say that and demonstrate it, they'll say that, oh, I'm just angry, I'm not charitable. But what I'm saying is true. What they're saying and doing is false. It's not Catholic. This is Protestant stuff. The sources, Dorothy Sayers, Doug Wilson, John Comenius, it's a Protestant idea about education. It's not Catholic education. It's a fake classical Catholic education. We need to go back to the actual Catholic education that existed before it was destroyed and replaced by all these modern schools. We need to restore real classical education, not simply back up to a different point in the history of the destruction of education. So in this video, I think I've made it clear quite confident that I've made it clear that these ideas that you can read literally all over Catholic school and homeschool websites. Go to the Mother of Divine Grace homeschool website, and you'll just see these are the ideas of the program. It's quotes from Dorothy Sayers all over the website. Quotes from a Protestant novelist that no one can explain how they would become the source of something that we would call a classical education. This is where they come from. It's not just Dorothy Sayers. They may use Dorothy Sayers quotes, but this is where it came from. It was Dorothy Sayers taken up by Douglas Wilson and turned into a Christian school movement in the 1990s that got rolling, and the Catholics simply brought it into Catholic circles. It's not Catholic education. So this is the fifth critique or reaction. People call them reaction videos. The fifth one that I've done on classical education. I'm pretty confident that this is crystal clear. Now, I always tell people, when it comes to classical education, there's the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and everything else. It doesn't matter if it's Protestant. If you go to Doug Wilson's school or Veritas Academy, like I talked about before, or if you go to Mother of Divine Grace, or if you go to these other classical Catholic programs, all of them are together with these Protestants as one group. That they're not restoring real classical Catholic education. They're not. At least a Protestant like Doug Wilson understands that and can explain it. The Catholics can't explain what they're doing or why they're doing it because they're simply following Protestants. Protestants can explain it. I can explain it because I was a member of that organization, the Association of Classical Christian Schools. I taught at 2 of their schools. I know exactly where these ideas came from, and I can't believe that Catholic people can be so undiscerning as to just drink it all in and never even slow down for a minute, never even pump the brakes to ask, wait a minute, where is this coming from? Never even a question. Just drink it in, hear what they say, turn around and start parroting and copying and pasting quotes and doing things and talking about saints and the Virgin Mary and the church. And this has nothing to do with the Virgin Mary. It has nothing to do with any of the saints. Has nothing to do with the history of the church. This is a Protestant educational movement. And Catholics are part of this movement, having no idea what they're even doing. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we are not part of this movement. We are working to restore the actual classical Catholic education that was in place before the Protestants, by these means, destroyed it and gave us the modern K-12, 25 years of education system, trying to make everything accessible so everyone could be equal and we don't have to recognize God's grace and sovereignty over our lives and vocations, and we can all just say we're all going to be doctors and we're all going to be pastors and we're all smarter than the Pope and we're all going to be astronauts and scientists. This is where these ideas come from. It's not Catholic thinking. So if you want to actually go back and give your children a real historical Catholic education, I'm not making it up when I say there's only one place, and it's the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's the only place where you can find the old, pre-Protestant, pre-Science Revolution classical Catholic education available in 2022 in your own home, thanks to the technology. So I trust that that's clear. I know that that's clear. I don't know what to tell you. If you choose to just continue following a Protestant movement, telling yourself that it's Catholic, what am I supposed to say? I think I am being charitable. If you would think about what I understand and how I respond and try to patiently help people understand it, you would know that I'm not being uncharitable. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Are you just going to ignore this and call me a jerk because you already spent money on your other program? You've already invested in it. You're working for one of those schools and you don't know what to do. That's not my fault. I would tell you the best thing to do is fix it. The best thing to do is fix it. And I'll give you myself as an example. In 2005, I was working for one of these schools, and all of the dots were starting to connect, and I knew that I had to convert to Catholicism. So what did I do? I left, and I converted. I had no idea what I was going to do. I had no idea where I was going to work. I had no idea where I was going to live. And you know what came out of that uncertainty, that decision to just fix it? What came out of that was the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. What am I supposed to say? That would be my advice. My advice would be fix it. Don't continue, following a program that you know is not true. Fix it. Fix it. If you're already invested, because man, they gobble up thousands and thousands of dollars selling you the great books and all this stuff. If you've already blown all your money and you need help, get in touch and we'll talk about, you can get started for free or ease your way in or something, but if you understand this, you've got to do something about it. You can't just keep going on like telling yourself that everything is... I know people, they find it hard to accept that someone like Laura Berquist could be promoting this and saying it's Catholic. It's hard to really believe that someone can do that, but that's what is being done. If you're in Mother of Divine Grace School, the ideas, go read the website, read the catalogs. This is where they come from. You can dress it up. You can give it a Marian title. You can put pictures of saints all over it, but it has nothing to do with Mary or those saints. It comes from this Protestant movement. So I hope that's helpful. We're already over an hour and 15 minutes. If you have any questions, please get in touch. I'm happy to help. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not critical. I understand that Catholics have been deluded by these Catholic people who have done this, and I'm willing to help. I'm willing to explain everything. Like I said, there's a book that I published titled Understanding Classical Catholic Education. It's available right on the homepage of our website for free, classicalliberarts.com. Download a PDF copy of that book and just start flipping through it. Send me your questions. Watch the videos I make because I try to explain things piece by piece. But if you want to fix it, get in touch because we can fix it. We can fix it. But you've got to make that decision. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.